What I do believe and what I do know is that there is something called the prison industrial complex in America. Now, I never used to use that phrase because I don't really like jargon. It sounded jargony to me, prison industrial complex. But last year, we had a ballot initiative in California. It would have been the biggest prison sentencing reform initiative in the history of the country. It would have reduced the California prison population by about 25,000 nonviolent offenders. It would have shifted $1 billion a year from prison and parole to treatment and rehabilitation. It would have saved taxpayers roughly $1 billion a year. It would have addressed California's prison overcrowding crisis. Right? We polled on it. We were ahead 2-1 in the polls going into this thing. And sometime in September, people got together in Sacramento and they said, we got to bring this thing down. And within a few weeks, the prison guards union there, the most powerful lobby in the state, had either contributed or raised a total of almost $4 million to run ads scaring the bejesus out of people, and they kicked our butt in the final thing. I can tell you that there are politicians there. You know, Jerry Brown, you think he'd be a decent guy? Not on this thing. Dianne Feinstein, the senator from, no. Basically, these guys just turned against us without ever looking at what it was about. We pulled together an initiative out of all the best expert commission stuff, sensible, pragmatic, reduce crime, reduce addiction, help people get their lives together. The real mark of power is when you tell somebody to do something and they do it without even asking why. And that's what the prison industrial complex is able to do in America today. When they tell politicians, this is what we think and what we want, in too many places in America, that's what the politicians do. That's what the elected officials do. And that's what needs to change. They have been empowered, overly empowered. They have been engorged with their power. And this is not to diss law enforcement officers per se, because a lot of good police and prosecutors and judges are actually doing a good job. They're enforcing laws. They're dealing with violent criminals. This is not to diss a whole class of human beings who go into law enforcement. I don't want to do that. I know some of you may be decent people, but when that is a system, becomes such a powerful political entity, when the jailers become the most powerful lobby in a state capital, something is fundamentally wrong. When private prison corporations are lobbying to put more people behind bars, when people are looking for things to do with empty prisons, you know there's a fundamental problem. Right? That's the complex that we're dealing with. And hopefully what all of you here are committed to is about challenging the power of that thing in America. Now, to give you a little background on this stuff, you know, before my time, when I was just in high school and college in the 70s, you know, there was the beginnings of some sanity emerging. There normal emerged, the marijuana legalization group, as you know, the movement of the marijuana consumer. 11 states decriminalized the possession of marijuana, under an ounce of marijuana. Many states passed resolutions or laws basically legalizing medical marijuana, at least as a research project, but most never implemented it. Right? And then by late 1970s, 30% of the American public said that marijuana should be legalized. President Carter, his Attorney General, introduced a federal decriminalization bill at that time. People were talking about what's called the harm reduction approach. They didn't use that language, but it was the basic approach that acknowledges that drugs are here to stay, that we're never going to get rid of them, and we have to figure out how to reduce their harms, reduce the downsides of addiction, reduce the disease, what have you. There was a moment, an opening there, and then it got swept away. It got buried into history. The books literally got taken off the shelves, right? Ronald Reagan came in, right? The country turned conservative. It turned reactionary. Drug testing began to spread. The younger generation in the 80s was not like the 60s. If the 60s were the rebels and the 70s were live and let live, the 80s were conformism. I want to go the corporate track, right? And I think also some of us made a mistake in the late 70s. Some of us thought, you know, marijuana legalization is inevitable. It's going to happen. There was an element of overconfidence. It's our time, we're going to do it, and we failed to be cautious. There were surveys showing that over 10% of high school seniors by the late 70s were smoking pot every day. Not a good thing. We all know, and none of us wants our kids waking and baking every day. right? We're pretty clear about that. But not to be attentive to that problem and that issue consistently meant that a lot of parents who are not necessarily drug warriors, they were freaked out about all this pot and everything else out there, right? So there was this sense of overconfidence, the country was turning, and what happened in the 80s was a nightmare. A nightmare. The marijuana thing got swept backward, cocaine became crack cocaine, went biased, the drug wars, the hysteria of the late 80s, the state legislators, Congress passing these absolutely draconian laws, I mean mandatory minimums. A friend of mine who was active and working in Congress at that time talked about sitting at legislative hearings, Democrats and Republicans, this was a bipartisan drug war. And people saying, well, I think we should increase the penalty for possession of cocaine to 5 years and a $10,000. No, let's make it 10 years and $50,000. No, somebody else make it 20 years. Right? Nobody thought about doing a cost-benefit study. Nobody thought, how much is it going to cost the taxpayer? Nobody thought, what is this going to do to human beings and their families, right? Nobody thought, it was just this emotional, nonsensical hysteria in which Democrats were afraid of Republicans beating them up for being soft on crime, and they believed this stuff as well. And we landed up with the disaster we're trying to work our way out of today. Well, I'll tell you, those late 80s and early 90s were a bleak period. And there was a small group of us beginning, it was across the political spectrum, you know, William Buckley and famous intellectual conservative, Milton Friedman, the famous economist, on the right, people like Ira Glass at the ACLU, the Baltimore mayor, Kurt Schmoke. I was teaching at Princeton, and a group of us kind of little people sort of say, wait a second here, this is crazy, this is crazy. And we're not necessarily saying you should legalize everything, but let's be aware that what you're doing here is doing nothing to reduce the problems of drug abuse, but everything to fill our prisons and to divert resources from the areas where it can help people to that where we're going to hurt people. All you're doing is sweeping up generations of young people, especially young black and brown people, men, into prisons. No. These were sort of voices in the wilderness for a while. But something happened in the mid-90s. It was an opportunity. And this is when I sort of left the university, set up my organization, it was called something else then, other people beginning to mobilize in this area. And we did a poll, public opinion poll, and we found that a majority of Americans were ready to peel off away from the drug war on one issue, medical marijuana. Turned out that 60% plus of Americans said marijuana should be legal for medical purposes back in 1995. It turned out, much to my surprise, that roughly 30% of Americans said that they knew somebody that they believed who used it for medical purposes. Right? And so, what to do with this? And then something happened, you know, these guys in California, Dennis Perot, had been AIDS activists, and now they've become medical marijuana activists. They drafted this initiative, wide open initiative, as you know, right? Wasn't going anywhere, sort of pipe dream. But somebody gave me, it was Ed Rosenthal, in fact, you know, the lead marijuana girl, called me up, and we need your help, can you get the big guys? And I was in a position to know that some very rich guys, George Soros, the famous philanthropist, Peter Lewis, progressive insurance guy, John Sperling, University of Phoenix, George Zimmer, the Men's Warehouse, Men's Real, that these guys all thought that the war on drugs stunk. And they all thought that the marijuana laws needed to be changed, for various reasons, some all different reasons. It was an opportunity to get these guys to put money on the table for a ballot initiative like we'd never done before. And we turned this thing into a professional campaign. And we took it away in '96, and we got more votes in the state of California than Bill Clinton did when he got reelected in 1996. And then, I'll tell you, the next thing we did